personalities around him. In the earliest years, Anthony was treated as a full and equal partner financially. According to former Van Halen manager Noel Monk, Anthony held responsibility for roughly a fifth of the band's debts and revenues and had a voice in business decisions. But as the band's fame grew and internal power struggles intensified, that balance began shifting away from him and toward Eddie, Alex, and Roth. Even so, Anthony stayed committed to music and to keeping the group moving forward, playing a steady, professional role for the making of Fair Warning and Diver Down even as tension mounted elsewhere in the band. Slowly, both fans and critics came to recognize him as one of the quiet pillars holding the band's sound together. By 1984, Van Halen had reached the peak of its commercial power. The album 1984 delivered massive hits, Jump, Panama, Hot for Teacher, and cemented the band's place among rock's biggest acts. But behind that success, Anthony's standing within the group was eroding. Noel Monk's memoir, Runnin' with the Devil, describes a pivotal and troubling moment during the 1984 tour. Anthony was reportedly pressured by Eddie, Alex, and Roth into signing away his future songwriting credits and royalties. Monk's account describes Anthony being handed the agreement backstage just hours before a show, with all three of his bandmates standing over him as he signed. The contract was retroactive, meaning it stripped him of credit and revenue from the 1984 album itself, despite his musical and vocal contributions to it. In one signature, Anthony went from an equal partner in the band to a higher performer with no ownership stake in its intellectual property. Monk has said he would have advised against it had he known in time, but Anthony reportedly went along with it rather than risk conflict or derail the tour. The financial consequences were severe and long-lasting. Anthony lost out on decades of potential income from licensing deals, greatest hits compilations, and reissues built on songs he had helped create. 1984 alone eventually sold more than 10 million copies in the United States, making the lost royalties especially painful. For years, Anthony stayed quiet about what had happened, maintaining professional public image and avoiding criticism of his bandmates. When he eventually did discuss it in interviews, he confirmed he'd signed under pressure, but framed his decision as one made to protect the band rather than himself. Music, he said, was what he wanted most, and keeping the group together mattered more to him than the money he gave up. In the years after Van Halen's commercial peak, Anthony noticed a shift in how his role was being described publicly, particularly by Eddie. Comments and interviews began to downplay his musical contributions, suggesting he lacked the instincts of a professional bassist. The most damaging came in a 2015 Billboard interview, when Eddie claimed he'd had to teach Anthony every note he played and accused him of lacking initiative. Fans and fellow musicians pushed back hard, calling the remarks both unfair and inconsistent with the historical record. Anthony later addressed the claims directly, insisting he had always learned the band's material independently and that no such teaching sessions had ever taken place. He pointed out that if they had occurred, there would be some record of it, and none existed. Beyond the professional sting, Anthony described the criticism as personally painful, especially coming from someone he'd known and worked alongside for decades. He called the experience emotionally exhausting, made worse by his own efforts to keep the peace within a band that was already fraying. He never turned it into a public feud, but he acknowledged that the growing distance between him and Eddie contributed to the collapse of their relationship. By the mid-2000s, communication between them had essentially stopped, and Anthony found himself pushed further from the band's core decision-making. The decline was visible in the studio long before it became official. During the making of 1998's Van Halen 3, Anthony played bass on only 3 of the album's 11 tracks, with Eddie handling bass duties on the rest, an early sign of how the internal dynamic was shifting. Anthony still toured and appeared in promotional material, but his diminished studio role raised questions among fans about where he really stood in the band. That marginalization continued into the 2000s. On the 2004 compilation, The Best of Both Worlds, Anthony didn't perform on any of the 3 new tracks, contributing only backing vocals. His final tour with Van Halen came that same year, a high-profile reunion with Sammy Hagar. But even that arrangement carried tension. According to Hagar, Anthony had to accept reduced pay and a contract that treated him more like a hired musician than a founding member just to be part. Van Halen is remembered for his explosive guitar work, wild stage shows, and the larger-than-life feuds that played out in the press for decades. But beneath the noise, one member held the group's sound and its business together with a steadiness few outsiders ever noticed. Michael Anthony's story is one of talent, loyalty, and a slow-motion betrayal that he didn't even learn about through a phone call. He found out from the internet, like everyone else. Michael Anthony grew up in a household where music wasn't a hobby, but a presence. His father, Walter Sobolewski, played trumpet, and young Michael spent countless hours listening to him rehearse and perform. That early exposure to live music shaped his ear and his curiosity about instruments long before he ever picked up a bass. Following his father's example, Anthony started on trumpet and stayed with it through his school years, eventually joining the marching band at Dana Junior High after his family moved to Southern California in the mid-1960s. The band gave him more than technical skill. It taught him discipline and what it meant to perform as part of a group, lessons that would serve him well decades later. By the time he turned 13, rock and roll had pulled him away from the trumpet. Wanting to stand out from friends who were already gravitating toward guitar and drums, he chose bass instead. A friend named Mike Hershey loaned him a Fender Mustang, which Anthony converted into a makeshift bass by pulling off 2 strings. That improvised instrument marked the start of a serious commitment to the low end. His father, noticing how much progress he was making, eventually bought him a proper Fender Precision bass and a Gibson amp, real tools for a musician who was clearly serious about his craft. Anthony studied the playing of bassists like Jack Bruce of Cream, John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin, and Harvey Brooks of Electric Flag, absorbing their techniques even though he was naturally left-handed and had to adapt to playing right-handed. That combination of natural talent, disciplined practice, and admiration for greats gave him a strong foundation that would prove essential once he joined Van Halen. In the early 1970s, Anthony worked his way through the Southern California club circuit, eventually landing in a power trio called Snake, where he played bass and handled lead vocals. The band mixed cover songs with original material and built a small but loyal following playing school dances, festivals, and clubs around Pasadena and Arcadia. It was here that Anthony's ambitions sharpened into something like a career plan. The local scene eventually brought Snake into contact with another rising local act, Mammoth, fronted by brothers Alex and Eddie Van Halen. The 2 bands occasionally shared bills, and during one show at Pasadena High School, Mammoth's PA system failed. Anthony offered up Snake's equipment so the performance could continue, a small act of generosity that left a lasting impression on the Van Halen brothers. Not long after, Mammoth lost its bassist, Mark Stone, leaving an opening. Remembering Anthony's professionalism from that earlier gig, Eddie and Alex invited him to a garage jam session to test chemistry. It clicked immediately. Anthony's driving bass lines and strong backing vocals gave the group a new dimension, and the brothers wasted no time bringing him on board. Soon after, the band changed its name from Mammoth to Van Halen, partly because another act already used the Mammoth name, and partly to put the brothers' identity front and center. With David Lee Roth on vocals, Eddie on guitar, Alex on drums, and Michael on bass, the classic lineup was complete. For Anthony, it wasn't just a new band. It was the beginning of an entirely different life. As Van Halen worked the Los Angeles club circuit through venues like Gazzarri's and the Whiskey A Go-Go, Anthony's contributions quickly became essential to the band's identity. His high, piercing backing vocals became a signature element of the Van Halen sound, offsetting Roth's lead vocals and giving the band a vocal blend that stood out in a crowded scene. His disciplined, unshowy bass playing anchored Eddie's virtuosic guitar runs and Alex's heavy drumming, letting the band sound both precise and raw at once. When Van Halen's self-titled debut arrived in 1978 on Warner Brothers, Anthony's fingerprints were all over it. Steady rhythmic groundwork on songs like Runnin' with the Devil and Ain't Talkin' 'Bout Love, and vocal harmonies that lifted tracks such as Jamie's Cryin' and Feel Your Love Tonight. The album broke the band commercially, and critics singled out Anthony's harmonies as a key part of its appeal. Through the relentless touring that followed, he earned a reputation within the band as a reliable, low-drama member, a contrast to the more volatile,